The lockdown in some districts of Guangzhou has been extended, which is why we've seen vision of an area where a lot of migrant workers resided, and they were actually sort of busting out and breaking down fences because the lockdown in that district had been extended yet again. There are also reports of food, difficulties obtaining enough food for some of those residents under lockdown in that area of Guangzhou. So we have seen from time to time, Bev, throughout the pandemic in Shanghai earlier this year, residents having had enough of the restrictions, even if it's temporarily venting their frustrations. This time around, though, it is different because it's kind of difficult to see what exactly is going on in China at the moment, but across different cities, we're getting a pretty clear idea, including in Guangzhou, that the response from authorities this time around seems to be taking a different turn.
So when you say it's taking a different turn, what are you seeing in terms of the response?
Well, just one example, Beijing today recorded officially about 200 or so cases, more than 400 yesterday by Beijing standards over the past 2.5 to 3 years. These are huge numbers. These are the biggest numbers Beijing has ever officially recorded. Now, one journalist was saying that yesterday the major transfer subway station, Xijimen, was shut off because of the relatively high number of cases by Chinese standards. Yet today it's open again. So even if there was this sort of knee-jerk reaction from officials, well, we must shut this subway station down and we must shut that down, the next day they say, actually, let's keep it open. And we're seeing across China in different cities a rather different response. The city of Shijiazhuang, for example, which is quite near Beijing, has roughly 10 or 11 million people. It's announced that it's suspending mass testing, even though it has hundreds, if not a few thousand daily cases. But then we're sort of seeing mixed messages. On the other hand, the central government, through its propaganda agencies this week, once again, Bev, said that the country must unswervingly stick to COVID zero. So it's kind of a bit of a contradictory feeling at the moment as we see outbreaks growing in cities like Chongqing, Guangzhou, Beijing, Shijiazhuang. And a lot of people are actually saying online, and who knows how true this is, that Xi Jinping's away. He's overdoing the summits in Southeast Asia. And so they don't expect to get clarity on which direction China's going to go with these outbreaks until he gets back, likely on Sunday. Now, it's a bit hard to believe that he couldn't be dictating orders from on the road, but that seems to be a sentiment that a lot of people have. They're going to have to wait a couple of days before they know what's next.
Yeah. And even if it is just a sort of testing of the waters, what exactly happens if there's a slight relaxation or refinement, I guess, too, we've talked about the fact that he has now his third term and that there may be a rethink of this very hardline zero COVID policy. So I guess time will tell as to whether they come back, if he does return and the very strict measures come back, or whether they still try this sort of different methodology to see how it plays out.
Well, this afternoon, the National Health Commission also said that plans are underway to boost the domestic vaccination rate in China, particularly among the elderly. Not a lot of details of those plans, but we know at high levels that the Chinese government, as one of the 20 conditions that it outlined last week on adjusting the pandemic policy, boosting the national vaccination rate is a priority. So let's wait and see on that one. The change in approach last week was only a bit of a loosening. Overall, it was described as an optimization of COVID zero. We're going to keep doing COVID zero, but we're going to do it more effectively. It's going to be more targeted. And most importantly for China's economy, it's going to take less of an economic toll on the world's second largest economy. But we've already seen cases go from a couple of thousand to about 23,000 a day just in the past week. It really is on an upward trajectory at the moment. So it's a bit hard to believe, Bev, that this leader who's been telling his country that this virus is so terrifying that the country must be locked off and disrupted for 3 years, that he somehow is just going to flick the switch. That's why there is so much uncertainty about what happens in a couple of days' time when Xi Jinping returns to China. And will they go back to lockdowns in some of these cities, or will they actually adjust to the idea of not living with COVID and letting it rip, so to speak, but living with a relatively low circulation of COVID in the community.
And you know, I think one of the things the Chinese authorities have always feared is their health system and how it copes with rising infections if they were serious, and then, of course, result in deaths.
Yeah, and that's still a legitimate concern, that if you do have a higher amount of COVID circulating, inevitably, as we've seen with every other country, we've seen it in Hong Kong as well, you are going to have an upsurge in deaths initially. So this is something that Xi Jinping and the Chinese government has been incredibly proud of, that they haven't had a sort of a mass death event. China does, if you believe the death figures, it has the world's lowest death rate compared to total case rate, but they do sort of play a bit funny with the definitions of what counts as a COVID death. So I wouldn't take that one quite as seriously as the overall case rate. I do genuinely believe, having been there at the outset of the pandemic, that the case numbers have been incredibly low over the last 3 years. But that's the really tough thing at the moment for Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership. On one hand, if they are going to really sustain this loosening up and allow some level of spread, how then do you politically justify that to the country, having told them that this virus needs to be feared for so long? Then again, Bev, it is China. There's no opposition party. There's no free media. So it probably isn't as difficult as we think.
Yeah, indeed. We will watch with interest. Good to talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bev.